To learn more about earning college credits with study hall courses, go to gostudyhall.com or click the link in the description. When we study history, it's easy to focus on, well, us, people. It's people who invade and people who invent and people who trade. We're the doers of history. But human intentions aren't the only things that shape the world. There are lots of forces outside our control that have shaped the past, and sometimes people have merely lit the metaphorical match that caught fire. In the case of international trade, we humans did a lot more than just move goods across the ocean and back again. Our international exchange brought society-transforming plants, animals, and diseases to new places where they would go on to make their own history. I'm Rob Fuller, and this is Study Hall, Modern World History. We call the exchange of plants, animals, and diseases between Europe, Africa, and the Americas the Columbian Exchange, since it began following Columbus's first expedition to the so-called New World in 1492. This term was coined by environmental historian Alfred Crosby in his 1972 book, The Columbian Exchange: Biological and Cultural Consequences of 1492, which was the first real exploration of the ecological and biological consequences of global trade. Of course, we know Columbus's invasion of the Americas involved war and genocide and really complex relationships between groups of people, but the moment had other ripple effects too. Simply introducing new crops or work animals can also significantly change a place, its people, and the course of history. As we already know, the fruits of trade are extensive and do include, quite literally, fruits and vegetables. That's right, one of the most impactful aspects of the Columbian Exchange was what indigenous Americans shared with Europeans: plants. The Spanish may have been looking for gold and silver, but the real good stuff was potatoes and corn. Potatoes could be grown in climates where other crops refused to thrive, and they could be preserved for much longer periods of time than most crops, which is especially valuable in parts of the world that have short harvests. This meant that in places like Russia, Ireland, and Ukraine, these hardy, nutritious plants became an essential part of people's diets. Across Northern Europe, famines became increasingly rare and populations boomed. In fact, when a famine did break out in Prussia in the mid-18th century, the king's solution was to order peasants to eat potatoes. French fries. And in Africa, cassava took the continent by storm. Cassava, or manioc, is a super versatile edible tuber that traveled from Brazil to the Portuguese territories of West Africa, Angola, and Mozambique. It remains popular in African cuisine today. So while the impacts of the Columbian Exchange weren't totally peachy, the resulting spread of American crops was largely beneficial to civilizations across the globe, or at least to their stomachs. But plants weren't the only things to sow seeds of change across the globe. The introduction of European herd animals also changed the course of history for the Americas. For indigenous Americans, the appearance of new animals was a major boon for both food and labor. While there were some domesticated animals in the Americas, the horses brought over by Europeans changed the way of life for indigenous groups who incorporated them into their culture. Before this, Great Plains peoples like the Kansa and the Wichita were largely sedentary communities. They farmed and hunted, but hunting big game like buffalo was a tall task on foot. But when the indigenous peoples got their hands on horses, they revolutionized hunting, trade, and warfare. Suddenly, large animals like bison and elk were easier to kill, and horses made transporting game easier. By the time the horses arrived in the Great Plains, more indigenous groups were moving inland, forced west by the arrival of Europeans along the Atlantic coast. Newcomers like the Dakota, Lakota, and Cheyenne were pushed out of their historical homes by settlers and forced to share land and resources with other indigenous peoples who were already settled in that region. Raids became a part of Great Plains culture, and tensions over resources often broke out into open conflict, the winners of which were typically those who had horses as their secret weapon. Other imported animals played practical roles too. Like horses, donkeys could do a lot of jobs that, before the Columbian Exchange, had to be done by humans. They worked in mines, like the Potosi mine in Bolivia transporting silver. They plowed farmlands from Chile to California. They transported goods and messages through the Amazon rainforest and along the Andes Mountains, places where wheeled vehicles couldn't exactly travel. Cattle made an impact on indigenous people's diets too. Cows found homes in the grasslands of what are now Argentina, Venezuela, Mexico, and Texas, providing nutrients to diets that were generally dependent on beans and eggs for protein. With waterfowl and other wild game, there was some meat in pre-Columbian diet, but it was very limited before the arrival of cattle. But like with everything in history, the introduction of these animals wasn't all sunshine and steak dinners. Some, like pigs and cows, ate up farmers' crops and local vegetation. But even more significantly, they served as vectors for something even more destructive: diseases. Cows, sheep, and pigs. While useful and tasty, these farm animals could spread diseases easily amongst each other because when we domesticate herd animals, we often keep them close together. This simply wasn't a problem for most indigenous peoples before. While pre-Columbian domesticated animals included dogs, llamas, guinea pigs, and the beloved stingless bee, among others, they roamed free and didn't result in the same rampant spread of diseases that came from imported European livestock. And the European colonizers unknowingly brought with them a number of deadly diseases, from smallpox to measles, from mumps to whooping cough, especially through their herd animals. Some of the diseases the Europeans and their animals carried, like the bubonic plague, had already devastated Afro-Eurasia. But many of the survivors developed an immunity to the disease, a genetic mutation that protected them from experiencing the full effects. In other words, many Europeans could spread the disease without getting sick themselves. And as more people in Europe became immune to a disease, it was harder for that disease to spread within their community, which we call herd immunity, but not to be confused with those herds of wild horses roaming the plains now. But all of the diseases that came with the Europeans were foreign to the peoples of the Americas, who had no immunity against them since they'd never been exposed to them before. It's hard to explain just how devastating the results of these diseases were to the indigenous populations. While no one knows the exact population of the Americas before Columbus's arrival, most historians agree with a number around 75 million. Between 1492 and 1600, that number dropped by 90%. Of course, many of those casualties were also the result of Europeans' intentional brutality against indigenous groups, as well as other environmental factors like drought. But what's truly, devastatingly remarkable is that as horrific as the Europeans' treatment of indigenous peoples was, the accidental spread of disease ravaged them potentially just as much. These diseases contributed to the massive loss of life that some historians refer to as the Indigenous Holocaust or the Great Dying. When we look back, it's easy to recognize the arrival of plants, animals, and diseases as a significant moment in history. In fact, some of the impacts of the Columbian Exchange have become so woven into the fabric of our lives that it's hard to imagine that things weren't always this way. But even the milder results of the Columbian Exchange took some getting used to. As you probably know, we humans aren't always the best at change. Like, if they're out of my usual toothpaste at the store and I have to get a slightly different mint flavor, well, suddenly my day's in a tailspin. Take food, for instance. While those foods like potatoes, corn, and cassava all became widely accepted because of their high yield, it wasn't always that way. The reason why the King of Prussia had to order peasants to eat potatoes is because those people didn't think they were safe to consume. And when red chili peppers arrived in Korea from Central and South America, they were called Southern barbarian peppers and thought to be poisonous. Trying new things, not really our strong suit, huh? And the problem wasn't just with American imports. The indigenous farmers got pretty fed up with those pesky cows always nibbling their crops. But over time, these foods became popular. So popular, in fact, that now they're at the heart of many national cuisines and cultures today. In India, red chili peppers became a central ingredient in curries, and just imagine the Italian cuisine we all know and love today without the tomatoes from America. Where would that leave Chef Boyardee? And as for those troublesome cows, well, cattle farming became a way of life from Argentina to Texas, where gauchos, or ranchers, remain an important part of society. If you're in eastern Bolivia, you may find yourself invited to a churrasco, a word that literally means grilled meat. While its name refers to beef, a churrasco is also a social event where people spend afternoons and evenings eating, drinking, and talking with friends and neighbors. And southern Brazil has exported this style of cooking around the world under the name rodízios, or all-you-can-eat steakhouses. But in addition to changing the ways of life for both indigenous Americans and Europeans, The Columbian Exchange sparked consequences that were more harmful and far-reaching. When Europeans saw that the climate and soil in the Americas, especially the Caribbean and Brazil, were perfect for growing sugar and coffee, they began establishing plantations and enslaving local people to produce them. And after disease and enslavement decimated the indigenous American population, Europeans looked to Africa as a source of free, captive labor, causing generations of trauma to the continent and its people. We'll be discussing the enslavement of African people more in future episodes. History is an enmeshment of what humans can and can't control, and the Columbian Exchange is a perfect example of that. When the Spanish first arrived in the Americas, their sights were set on riches, land, and power, regardless of the cost to indigenous peoples. But they couldn't have predicted the massive effects that the exchange of plants and animals, as well as new diseases, would have on global civilizations, not just their own. The traders, invaders, and victims of the Columbian Exchange were still centuries away from the instantaneous global interactions of today, but they were a part of the very beginnings of one of the biggest changes in history, connecting the entire world for better and for worse. If you're enjoying Study Hall Modern World History and are interested in taking an online course and earning college credit, go to gostudyhall.com or click on this button to learn more. Thanks for watching. See you next time.